Hi, Dr. Carrington. So my name's Luke Carter. I'm one of the Haematology registrars in the Northwest. So it's a pleasure to meet you today. So I understand it was Liverpool University where your career first started. Would you say it was at that point that you wanted to be a haematologist?
It was. I was inspired, as I guess a lot of haematologists are, by one person. And that was the Professor of Hematology in Liverpool, Alistair Bellingham. And he was a really enthusiastic teacher. I mean, his lectures were fantastic. It was clear he enjoyed the job and enjoyed the subject. And so I was inspired, probably as a third-year medical student. But that's why I think it's really important that we should take it upon ourselves to inspire the haematologists of the future.
So then I understand after you did your general house jobs and things, you moved on to kind of haematology training in the Northwest. I'm just wondering kind of what the differences were when you were a registrar. You know, I take it you didn't have kind of e-portfolio or something, for example.
E-portfolio? We didn't even have a portfolio, and certainly not an electronic one. I think training was a bit more informal in those days. Certainly now it's very formalised and you have to do everything to go into your portfolio.
And what were the pressures of training, would you say then?
The pressures were trying to get some time in the laboratory with the pressures of the clinical workload.
And how long was training back then? Was it kind of still the same kind of 4 or 5 years?
There or thereabouts. Terminology was different. Yeah. I did a rotational registrar job in haematology in Manchester for about 2 years, and then a senior registrar job for about 4 or 5 years. And I actually did a rotational SHO job in pathology before going on to the registrar training scheme.
And I know after your training you went and did some work over in San Francisco, is that right?
It was towards the end of my training. The way it came about was my wife, who's a radiologist, got offered a position of a visiting assistant professorship in San Francisco. So she went over quite quickly. I was able to follow her over after about 3 months or so. And I worked in a research laboratory with Professor Jack Levin. His laboratory interest was platelet production. And I knew nothing other than routine trainee might know about platelet production, but I studied it fairly quickly, and in the time that I was there, which was just about 6 months or so, did a series of experiments, wrote up a paper, subsequently first author paper in Blood and one in experimental hematology, all within 6 months of landing without knowing anything about platelets.
And would you encourage every kind of trainee to kind of have a go at going away somewhere, doing some research, or do you think it's more of a kind of if you're interested in it sort of thing?
It was certainly beneficial to me. If the opportunity arises, seize it, would be my advice.
Often people see haematology as a kind of a tertiary referral type specialty, but I know that you're a keen proponent of what a haematologist can do in a district general hospital. Could you tell me a wee bit about that?
Well, one of the more rewarding things I did in the DGH setting was to set up a peripheral blood stem cell transplant service. So this was around the time, the sort of late 1990s, that peripheral blood stem cell transplantation became really popular.
Yeah.
And so I'd recently worked at the Christie prior to my appointment, so I was able to set up some of the transplant regimens for that. So we launched a charitable appeal to get all the equipment, the cell separator and the freezer. And we did quite a number of stem cell transplants, some of whom are still seen in the clinic today.
You were just telling me as well, Paddy, that one of your most notable publications was an article about what to do when your hospital blood bank burns down. Tell me about that.
Well, it did. It was in my first year as a consultant. I deny all responsibility, of course, but we were housed, the laboratory at the time, in an old wooden building at the back of the hospital. Mm-hmm. Wasn't really fit for purpose. Sure. Had a shelf life of about 10 years and it was 35 years old by that time. And one morning it burnt down. It was an electrical fault in the blood bank. I was just in the shower at the time, so I wasn't guilty. I was just phoned and said, "Dr. Carrington, do you know the laboratory's on fire?" But it was a very valuable learning experience, and we were able to demonstrate that the hospital can't function without a transfusion laboratory or hematology. So the hospital had to close couldn't do any surgery, had to close its A&E for about 2 days until we could get it up and running again. And perhaps it'd be good to take this opportunity to thank the army at the time, because they turned up with a blood fridge on a lorry the very next morning.
So Paddy, another thing that we were kind of chatting about when we were thinking about this interview, and I was sort of mentioning that, you know, haematology and being a doctor is a long career, and I understand, you know, for some consultants it's very easy, you know, for fatigue to set in and the like, but you said something that was quite inspirational actually about what you do for the relatives of patients that have kind of passed away under your care. Could you share that with us?
I think one of the things about haematology is that you get to know your patients quite well. So over the years you develop a relationship with them and their families. So what I always do when a patient of mine with a haematological malignancy dies is I write a letter to the family, to the relatives, and make sure I handwrite it, I don't just dictate it and sign it. And just say it was a privilege to care for their husband, wife, whatever. And a few anecdotes about their time under my care, and perhaps something about what happened near the end. And I think the relatives really treasure that. And I know some of them that I met over the years. There's one lady who, she lives around here, always used to throw her arms around around me whenever I met her in Marks and Spencer's. But yes, I think that's something that every haematologist should think of doing. So
tell us first of all how you first got involved in the British Society of Haematology.
I was appointed in 1993, and I think the current regional representative at the BSH in 1997 suggested that I might want to take over in that role, so that was the first involvement with the BSH. But the regional representatives at that time didn't really have too much of a role in the society, but it did give me an insight into the society itself. But what started my interest was my interest in evidence-based medicine and guidelines.
I've certainly seen your name on quite a lot of them.
The way it started was I was working in 2 hospitals, and it was clear that the junior staff who rotated through the haematology departments didn't quite know what they were doing or how things were done. So I wrote a handbook to help them with the various protocols. And I developed that over the years in conjunction with some regional meetings that we organised to talk about treatment of myeloma or treatment of lymphoma. Yeah. So that ran over the course of about 8 or 9 years. We updated the regional guidelines twice yearly. And then in late 1990s, a post came up for the director of the British Committee for Standards in Hematology. So I applied for that post. I didn't get it, but as a consolation prize, the two people who didn't get the post became members of task forces. So I became a member of the Hematology Task Force. So I contributed to a few guidelines at that time. And then I subsequently became secretary of the British Committee for Standards in Haematology. So that's how I became involved in the society.
Was it difficult to balance your kind of clinical commitments with all the things that you were doing for the British Society of Haematology at this time?
Around about that time it was busy because I was working in 2 hospitals. Yeah. So I had a split site job between Hope and Trafford. Yeah. So I was about half time in each, looking after inpatients with high-grade lymphoma, acute leukemia, stem cell transplant patients in both hospitals. Wow. Doing on-call for HEMOC in 2 places at the weekends with very little junior staff cover. So yes, it was busy at that time clinically, and the other work had to fit in and around that.
And then how did you make the step up to being president of the BSH?
Well, there was still a gap between secretary of the British Committee for Standards in Haematology. I did that for about 5 years or so. And then I changed from being secretary of the BCSH to being secretary of the BSH, which is quite a useful and important position. It gives you a real insight into the society because you're there for between 3 and 6 years. So you're a bit like almost the permanent under-secretaries in the government department with presidents coming and going. So you really know how the society works. So during that time I could see a few things that I felt needed to be changed, and I felt that I was the person to do that. So then I put myself forward for president.
Fantastic. And what year was it that you were crowned the president of the BSH?
You don't get a crown, unfortunately, but my presidential year was from April 2015 to a year later.
And it's probably quite a difficult and unfair question, but your best achievement in your time in the BSH, either as president or previously?
The first thing to say about the BSH, you achieve things as part of a team.
Yeah.
So it's not an individual achievement. And I think it was really because the three presidents, they were my two successors as president, all three of us were on the same page as to what changes needed to be made to the society, that it was possible to make those changes.
How did you go about achieving the increase in popularity? Because certainly I understand the numbers after you were president really kind of sequentially increased.
In the review, the annual scientific meeting was identified as one of the weaknesses of the society. And it was under threat from other meetings, particularly international meetings, but also national meetings within the UK. So it was identified as a problem. Yeah. So we tackled it as part of the strategic plan. So it was one of the 5 key objectives of that plan. During my presidential year, at that time, the president was responsible for organising the content of the meeting. So I was able to change quite a lot about the meeting itself. So compared with the meeting the year before in Edinburgh in 2015, we were able to double the size of the meeting. We doubled the numbers of simultaneous sessions from 20 in 2015 to 42 in 2016. And I also introduced numerous other changes, including meet the expert sessions, a take-home message session, and I also introduced sessions for all the national hematology groups and 4 sessions for the Global Hematology Committee. But one of the key things was to try and make sure that we covered everything. If not every year, we retained a memory of what had happened the previous year, and if someone had missed out, they got slots in the subsequent meeting.
So just really to think more kind of holistically about your career then, do you have any kind of one particular moment that now you're edging towards retirement that you look back particularly fondly at, or is it just a general feeling of you've achieved quite a lot through your career?
I don't think there is one moment. Working for the BSH has been fantastic. It was obviously a privilege to be president. Perhaps one moment might be the presidential dinner, when I was honoured to be able to invite back the person who inspired me to do haematology. I was also able to invite Jack Levin, the professor I worked with in San Francisco, to be a speaker at the meeting, and Marty Liggett, the CEO of ASH. So to have those people around the table on that night, I think that was a significant moment.
It's a really difficult question, but where do you see haematology in 60 years' time when we're celebrating the 120th birthday of BSH?
And looking back to what was available, what treatments and diagnostic tests were available 60 years ago, has been a real eye-opener. So if you turn the clock backwards, that was round about the time that the Coulter principle had been identified and the very earliest particle counters were coming out. So if you fast forward 60 years to not just blood counters now, but what we can do in terms of analysing diagnostic specimens in terms of genomics and so on. It's mind-boggling, the change over that time. And so you just can't imagine what will be available 60 years from now.
What would you tell your younger self if you were starting your career again?
I think in relation to haematology and a career, just go for it. In the sense that if you have an opportunity and it's difficult, do it. And if you have a choice between doing something that's easy or doing something that's difficult, choose the difficult one. Because you never know where it will lead.
And I just wanted to say, thank you very much on behalf of everyone at the BSH for, everything that you've done for the Society and for haematology over the years, and wish you the very best for retirement next spring.
It's been good fun. Thank you for coming.